evening, Central Georgia. I'm meteorologist Jordan West. Got a lot going on in terms of the tropics right now. Let's break it down. For starters, we got Fiona, a Category 4, what will be eventually a Category 3 hurricane in the Atlantic Ocean. Currently not a threat to the United States. Gaston, similar situation. Tropical storm Gaston is off in the eastern portions of the Atlantic Ocean, as well as Hermine, and we even got some development going on out there. But the main situation that we're kind of focusing on is what is currently Tropical Depression 9, currently in the Caribbean Sea. And now this storm will eventually turn itself into Tropical Storm Ian. Now winds are currently at 35 miles per hour. Once it reaches 40 miles per hour, that's when it's tropical storm strength. Pressure currently at 1006 millibars, movement west-northwest at 15 miles per hour. So it's headed in that direction towards the Gulf of Mexico, which is why we are keeping an eye out on it. Now notice this low pressure is kind of sitting here. Meanwhile, all of the convection, rain, and clouds are in the western half of the storm. Well, that's actually just one of the things we look at in terms of strengthening with this system. At the moment, or at least over the past 24 hours, it hasn't really been strengthening all that much, but there are a lot of things we look at in terms of strengthening. For starters, the water vapor satellite imagery. This is showing a lot of the dynamics of the atmosphere. The dry air, the orange that you see here on the screen, versus the wet air, the blue, the gray, clouds, all that moisture that we see. Well, let's look at an example. For starters, Fiona. This is all the dry air that we see with Fiona. The orange, the brown, the gray, the tan color. That's all dry air moving in from a cold front we actually saw a couple of nights ago. Meanwhile, the moist air, Hurricane Fiona, is steadily dropping. It's going to drop pretty quickly from a Category 4 hurricane to a Category 3, 2, 1, back into an area of low pressure. And that's because this dry air is kind of coming in and kind of making itself into Fiona herself. So overall, this dry air is what's determining the strength of this hurricane. And we're going to see that with what will be Ian. We're not seeing any dry air surrounding this system. Therefore, we know that it's really going to start to develop. But if we see dry air, we know that it will start to weaken just a little bit. But that's not the only thing we kind of look at in terms of the tropics, whether or not things will develop or not. We also look at tropical wind shear, which is the change in wind speed or wind direction with height. And that's typically why we are seeing right now with the low being on the eastern side and why the cloud cover and moisture and rain is on the western side of the system, because basically the entire tropical area, the tropical depression herself, is really tilted at the moment, and that will halt any development. Now, this is all the shear that we see out in the Caribbean Sea at the moment. This green, light blue area, that's all that shear. If you can notice, this low pressure area, what will be Ian, is now headed away from that shear. Another reason why we're going to see some development with this storm. The last reason is sea surface temperatures. Now, it's going to get really hot over the next couple of days before we see some fronts, but if you notice, we have all this red here in most of the Atlantic. That's temperatures anywhere between 80 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, the Gulf of Mexico, it's really, really warm, and that warm air counts as like energy to fuel these storms. So with a low shear environment, high sea surface temperatures, and no dry air surrounding this system, this little area of development, we're going to see this storm really ramp up over the next couple of days. That's why we really have an eye out on it. Now, these are just two models that we typically look at in terms of these storms, the GFS model, the American model, and the European model. Let's see how these storms, or at least these models, agree with each other. Looks like, for starters, Cuba, western half of Cuba, it looks like you guys are going to be impacted by this storm. This is Tuesday at 6 a.m. Meanwhile, moving into Wednesday around 4 a.m. in the morning, just off the western coast of Florida. That's what the European model says. GFS, still a little bit to the west, but the thing is, the eastern side of the storm, which is this area here, is where we see the dirty side of the storm. A lot more convection, a lot more rain, a lot more tornadic activity. So overall, it looks like Florida is going to be impacted either way it go. That's what we're seeing for now anyways. Meanwhile, I'm going to step over here. the GFS is kind of splitting this storm into two as well, but it looks like the majority of it will still be impacting much of central Georgia. Meanwhile, the European model has it going up, looks like towards southern or South Carolina, North Carolina by Friday around 4 o'clock. This is why we're keeping an eye on this thing. We don't really know where it's going to go yet. We'll look at the cone a little bit later, but nevertheless, the United States will be impacted by whatever this is going to brew out into over the next week or so. It's not going to be making landfall until Wednesday and Thursday of next week, but luckily we do have a lot of information about this storm already. The hurricane hunters are already starting to fly in there later on this evening to see what's going on with this system, to see if they can get better data so that they can then put that data into these models and get a better, more accurate forecast. Now the pressure with this thing, again, 1006 millibars. Let's see where it's going to go. This is the cone of uncertainty issued by the National Hurricane Center. And as you can see, by Monday, 2 o'clock, Category 1 hurricane affecting much of western Cuba, really will affecting all of Cuba because, again, it'll be on the dirty side of the storm. Meanwhile, by Category 3 strength by Wednesday at 2 o'clock, currently aligned to affect Florida at the moment. Again, moving west-northwest at 15 miles per hour, relatively a fast-moving storm, again, which is a good thing. You know, the faster the storm, the less destruction it can cause. So that's the cone of uncertainty. And it's also important to remember that this cone, you know, tracks where the eye will be. So the eye of the hurricane could come as west as the panhandle of Florida, or just off the eastern coast of Florida. So again, a lot to consider with this cone. This cone can easily change where it's going to go over the next couple of days. Remember, this is a story of staying informed, not as far as what's going to happen currently at this time. Now, as we move into Friday, this global model plots are showing, you know, all these models are agreeing that it's headed for Florida, but a lot of things can change really quickly because, I mean, even the GFS ensemble models have it still going all over the place. So a lot of different computers doing a lot of different things. Overall, just stay up to date. We get more information every single day and a lot to take in at times, but overall, it's best to stay nice and informed. Now, in terms of everything else that's going on, I still got a lot of other stuff to cover. Fiona out here, Category 3 hurricane at the moment, winds at 125 miles per hour. Headed out of the area of the United States. As you can see, this cone of uncertainty is a lot more tighter, better idea of where it's going to go. But overall, looks like it is going to shrink back down into a area of low pressure and kind of affect Canada in some regions. Meanwhile, we got Tropical Storm Gaston. Similar situation. Doesn't look like it's going to affect anybody. It's headed westward into the Atlantic Ocean, but overall, it's way out there. If there's anything further concern, we will, of course, keep you updated. Meanwhile, we also have Tropical Storm Hermine off the western coast of Africa, headed northward. And then we have another little area of development, 20% chance over the next 5 days. Again, overall, all these are out there, you know, in the Atlantic off the western coast. Nothing cause for concern just yet. Now, none of this is uncommon. You know, we're still in really the peak of hurricane season at the moment. It's been relatively quiet despite, you know, the likelihood of storms early on. But, you know, we're starting to really get them in. We got 5 areas out there of potential tropical development. And if we look at our September formation regions, again, this is not unlikely, you know. We're seeing these storms form, Fiona, you know, what will be in areas where it's highly favored in September. So, again, this is not unlikely. This is actually quite normal for this time of year. And as always, you at home should prepare accordingly. Now, the hurricane season's names list looks like Ian, Julia, and Carl, the next 3 names on the list. That's Ian, what I've been mentioning before, that was Tropical Depression 9. What is currently Tropical Depression 9 will eventually turn into Tropical Storm Ian. Anything else that forms later on will be Julia, Carl, and as well as Lisa, Martin, and Nicole. Now, just to compare last year we went through this whole list of names, but we didn't see any other storms pop up. So I would say that we're on track this time of year despite a very slow startup. Nevertheless, you always want to stay up to date on all things tropics. You can look at us on your app, social media, on my Facebook page, at @MetJordanWest. You can also, we'll be live on there all the time, but we'll be kind of keeping track on these storms. Got a lot to cover. Nevertheless, we will be here any time of the day, any time of the night, if anything were to come and affect Central Georgia area. For now, though, I'm meteorologist Jordan West, 13 WMAZ News.